All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to be talking about the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court is part of the judicial branch, which we started talking about this week. If you'll remember, the legislative branch's main duty is to make the laws, the executive branch's main duty is to enforce the laws, and the judicial branch's main duty is to interpret the laws. Now, what interpreting the laws means is that basically, those people who work in our court system, like judges, lawyers, those kinds of things, it's their job to tell us what the law means in certain cases. Now, when we're talking about the Supreme Court, when we're talking about the laws that they interpret, most of the time, what the Supreme Court interprets is the U.S. Constitution, or the document that basically outlines our entire government and how that works. So, just to give you a brief overview of the Supreme Court, basically what it is, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States of America. So, if you have a case that starts in the lowest of the General District Court in Roanoke County and you appeal it as high as it can possibly go, and if you'll remember, appealing a case basically means that if your case is tried at a local level, you don't like the result, you can appeal it to the next step up in the court system. Now, if you keep appealing and appealing and appealing, the very last place that it can go is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has the final say in all judicial matters in America. That means what the Supreme Court says goes. Once it's been appealed to the Supreme Court, there's nowhere else that your decision can go. That decision is final. So, who makes up the Supreme Court? So, there are 9 Supreme Court justices. Now, a justice is basically just a judge. That means that there are 9 judges that sit on the Supreme Court. The interesting thing about these judges is that once they get their job, they have their job for life. So their term length is infinite, basically, until they die. Right? So the only way that we can have a new justice is if a justice that's already on the Supreme Court retires or is impeached or dies, basically. So there are only 3 ways that you can stop being a Supreme Court justice. That's to retire, get impeached, or die. And just a reminder, the President of the United States appoints all Supreme Court justices. So the President gets to pick and say, oh, hey, Mr. Thompson, you seem like a great judge. I think I want you to be on the Supreme Court. I'm appointing you to the Supreme Court. But we know because of checks and balances, I wouldn't automatically get to be on the Supreme Court because the Senate has the ability to check the power of the president. The Senate is part of the legislative branch, and so they can check the power of the president by confirming my appointment to the Supreme Court. So currently, there are, like we said, 9 Supreme Court justices. This fellow right here in the middle, his name is John Roberts. He is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That means he's in charge of all the other justices. So President Trump has appointed 2 Supreme Court justices so far during his term. That's this fellow right here and this guy over here. President Obama appointed this lady. Her name is Sonia Sotomayor. And then this lady right here is one of the most famous Supreme Court justices right now. Her name is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Sometimes she's called the Notorious RBG. And she is getting on up there in age. She's had some health scares, but she is really holding on. She doesn't want to retire yet. She thinks she's still doing good work, and so she's staying in there. And remember, a Supreme Court nomination is for life, so she can stay in there as long as she wants. If she lived to be 120 years old and she still wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, then she could still be a Supreme Court justice. So, like I said, the newest Supreme Court justice is this fellow right here. His name's Brett Kavanaugh. He was appointed by Donald Trump in 2017 or 18, I believe. And some of you might remember he actually had a very long confirmation process in the Senate because he had some things in his background that a lot of people didn't like. And so he eventually was confirmed by the Senate, but it took a little while to get through that whole process. So when we're talking about the Supreme Court, remember that it's a court, and so it hears different kinds of cases, criminal cases, civil cases, whatever they may be. But the only cases that the Supreme Court hears are ones that are of national importance and that deal with the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So the Supreme Court is not going to hear a civil case between Mr. Thompson and Mr. Garden because Mr. Garden made his classroom door really ugly and Mr. Thompson didn't like it, and so he sued him. The Supreme Court's not going to hear that. The Supreme Court is only going to hear really, really important cases that deal with the way the entire United States functions. So I'm talking about things like Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review. I'm talking about things like Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the original separate but equal rule, and then Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned separate but equal. Those kinds of things that have to deal with the way that the entire United States works, those are the things that the Supreme Court is going to hear. And then obviously a decision is reached by majority rules. So remember, there are 9 Supreme Court justices. So if 5 of them rule one way, then that's enough to win the case. That's the inside. So it's actually really hard to see pictures of the inside of the Supreme Court because you're not really supposed to have a camera in there. That's why this one's not great quality. Somebody definitely took that picture when they were not supposed to. This is the outside. That's Mr. Garden and some of his students a couple years ago on the steps of the Supreme Court. The writing right here along the top says equal justice under the law. So just to take you back to some important justices we've had over the years, our first African-American justice to the Supreme Court was a guy named Thurgood Marshall. We now have another person who has filled that spot. He's also an African-American on the Supreme Court. His name's Clarence Thomas. The first female Supreme Court justice was this lady. Her name's Sandra Day O'Connor. And our first Hispanic American Supreme Court justice is Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by President Obama during his term as president. So, one of the most important things that you will learn during the judicial branch unit is about the idea of judicial review. So what judicial review is basically the power of the court to decide if a law or a presidential action is fair or unfair according to the Constitution. So what that basically means is that the Supreme Court has the ability to declare laws unconstitutional if they conflict with the Constitution itself. So if Congress or the president does something and the Supreme Court decides, that doesn't align with the way the Constitution is written, the Supreme Court can declare that law or that presidential action unconstitutional, and then it is null and void. And this idea of judicial review was established by the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And basically what happened was James Madison was the president at the time, and this guy named John Marbury was basically supposed to become a judge. He had gotten an appointment through the last president, and James Madison was like, nah, I don't want you to be judge, so I'm not going to give it to you. And the Constitution actually ruled and said that, it actually ruled and said in judicial review, the Supreme Court ruled that James Madison was not required to give John Marbury that commission. And that's basically all I've got for the Supreme Court. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Ooh, one more thing. We'll talk about jurisdiction real quick. This is one of the things that you learned about in your judicial vocab PowerPoint there. Jurisdiction is basically the ability for a certain court to apply the law or hear a court case. So if the General District Court of Roanoke County has jurisdiction in Roanoke County, that means that if a law is broken in Roanoke County, it will be heard. That court case will go to the Roanoke County District Court. So that's called original jurisdiction. The original place where it goes is original jurisdiction, the first court that it goes to. Now, if you don't like the result of your case in the original jurisdiction court, then you can appeal your case to an appellate court, or a court with appellate jurisdiction. These courts basically only deal with appeals. That means that they don't have original jurisdiction. They don't hear cases for the first time. They only review the decisions of cases from lower courts. So if a federal law was broken, maybe somebody was transporting illegal drugs across state lines, they got arrested and it went to the district court in Virginia. They didn't like their decision at the district court and they appealed their decision to the circuit court. When the circuit court hears their case, they're serving as an appellate court because somebody has appealed their decision from the original court to an appellate court. All right, that's all I've got for today. You guys let me know if you have any questions.